So, Bob, I really appreciate you taking time today to join me for this quick interview. I think our audience is going to find it great. So, thank you very much.
Oh, you're quite welcome. Glad to be here.
So, I wanted to just get started and ask you, when did you know you wanted to be in design?
Well, pretty much from when I was a little boy, I was always taking things apart, very curious that way. If I wasn't drawing or making something, I was in the garage when I was a little older trying to take my mother's car apart. And I had some really good mentorship as I went through my school years from art teachers. And actually, when I was in high school, living in New Jersey, I went in every Saturday to some of the art and design schools that were in Manhattan and took Saturday classes at the Art Students League of New York and the New School, as it was then called. And I was just always on that pathway.
I love it. Bob, that's a great story. So, now how does that translate into the career that's kind of come about for you?
So actually, when I went to art school, I went to the Kansas City Art Institute, very far away from where I grew up, and I had intended to be a fine artist. I wanted to go into sculpture. That would help my parents know that I would never work a day in my life, and they would be on their payroll forever. But I quickly realized that, given the times it was, that I really had a love of design and how things were made, and I quickly transferred after my freshman year into industrial design, and I just kind of never looked back after that.
And how did that make your parents feel?
My parents were very happy. They thought then I would be employable as it went along, and the deeper that I got into it, the more I realized that I really wasn't done with my education as an undergraduate, and decided to go to Rhode Island School of Design as a graduate student. And honestly, that's what changed my life.
Well, I love it. That's fantastic. Um, so let's talk a little bit about just human-centered design. And there seems to be various interpretations of what human-centered design is. How do you define it?
So this is a very interesting question. There's the simple answer is to take technology and put it into a form people can use, but do it in an informed way. We find that when we're doing our work, if I ask you what you do, you'll tell me. If I ask you what you want, you can only tell me what you want in the past because you can't see the future, perhaps, like I can if I'm working in a particular industry. But if I observe your behavior and I ask you what you want, and I try to match those two things up, where the conflicts are, and there are always conflicts, where the conflicts are, that white space in between is usually where innovation opportunities are hiding. And so we often look at how we hear what people say and then watch what they do. So when I was in Motorola, for example, and we were working with cops and firefighters on communications gear, you could ask them about color, but they won't talk about it. But you could follow them around and look at the palette they've created in their own life, the tools that they use, the choices they make, and the clothing they wear. What do they have in their toolbox? What kind of car do they drive? What color is it? You can derive a color palette that's pleasing to them based on the choices they made from their behavior, not what they were willing to tell you. You can ask a trauma team who's moving a patient from the emergency room to the operating room to give you the protocol of how to do that, and they will give it to you with their eyes closed. But if you observe what they do, they don't realize how much they're fumbling with cables and wires and tubing and how much time that's taking, or how long it takes the elevator to come. That's not built into their muscle memory so much. And those are where the opportunities to innovate usually lie. So when we think about human-centered design, it's that conundrum, which technically is called the zone of supposed paradox. It's looking carefully at the say versus do and beginning with that.
That's a mouthful, that's for sure. I'm glad we'll have the slides here to help the audience walk along with that. So, as you know, this past September, the Harvard Business Review dedicated an entire issue design. What was your reaction to this kind of, sort of mainstream media attention to design?
So it's wonderful that they did that, and the article was quite in depth and widely read. Still widely read. I still see it around. People talk about it. Really, the change for design took place around 1990, when when Business Week magazine decided to annually publish the results of the what's now called the International Design Excellence Awards, and they realized that design was a franchise that they could own from some other articles they'd published. Well, what was interesting about that is now you had business talking about design rather than designers trying to pitch design. So we love the fact that that went on for a long, long time, and then publications like Fast Company jumped in, and Wired, and other mainstream media jumped in, and to see the Harvard Business Review continue that legacy is fascinating.
So it's 1990 through today, though, it's still evolving, don't you think?
It's a never ending. It's just like our careers. It's a constant state of learning, and business constantly needs to be reminded that design can be used to drive organic business growth. It's not simply sort of that last decoration station on the way to market in the back of the house, and that's really how we work to position design in GE Healthcare.
Excellent. Speaking of which, let's talk about design thinking at large companies. And obviously, you work for a large company. What is the status of human-centered design, at GE from your perspective?
Well, because we're a large company, I also benefit from the fact that we have a large and very talented design team and user experience team around the world, and 6 studios in 5 countries. We have about 60 people of a variety of related disciplines. And some of what we have to do is not what the business initially expects. So I use the word, and I use it with love in my heart and a great deal of respect, a little bit of subversion. If I come to you and I have a great idea and a way to do it, and you're running a business and you have your agenda, it'll immediately get killed off. It's just like, go away, son, you bother me. What I have to do is I have to bring evidence. I have to show them. So oftentimes we will always give the business what it requests or what they think they're requesting, but we'll also give them something they never dreamed was possible. And that's usually where we bring in, through advanced concept, the principles of design thinking, or we show them what the user need is, or we consider the guy who cleans up at night, not just the doctor operating the piece of equipment, or the patient and their families. And we have to continue to talk about that and evangelize that and do it in a way where we demonstrate how that works, not just talk about it.
So, my next question that I had prepped, you've kind of already answered, which is, how is GE Healthcare integrating, human-centered design into your product and development process? But any elaboration?
Well, it's not entirely easy, or even in any company, not just GE, even in the design-driven companies. Our number one responsibility is to get the work out and deliver on the business and help the businesses make their objectives. And so a lot of the things that we're doing, which feel like soft qualities of creating our product, aren't necessarily quickly understood when you're strictly speaking in a business or an engineering or a marketing or manufacturing paradigm. So we have to carefully make the case that we're getting the work done, but we're doing it in the most appropriate, most advanced kind of a way. And it's not entirely easy to do that. I would say, GE Healthcare, as well as any, understand that human beings have to use these very scary medical devices, and human beings are actually subjected to them. They have to operate them, they have to clean them, they have to fix them. That's basically designing for human beings. And even while the technology is the essence of what the company produces, the human-centered aspects of it are not lost on them.
So you talked about lovingly using subversive techniques to get buy-in, and talk a little bit about how the business leaders, when they learn that you've done that, and have also they've benefited from your efforts there.
So, in order to do this kind of work, anything in innovation, you have to, and especially in a big company, you have to be willing to get a bloody nose. You have to be willing to put your neck out there a little bit, because we're doing things often that we're not asked to do, but we know are things that can complement and supplement what the business is doing that we're serving. And so we oftentimes, as I said, we'll do something alongside the thing we're assigned to that they never dreamed was possible. And most of the time, it's very well received, and sometimes it becomes the next program that they do. Even though they didn't ask us to do it, the lights go on. Are we the greatest gift to innovation in the world? No, not necessarily. There's thousands of incredibly smart people in our company. But we do what we do very well. It's not our hobby, it's our job, one of my colleagues likes to say. And, uh, and so therefore it's usually well received. And if it's very well received, you'll get another business leader sort of leaning around the corner saying, how do I get some of that?
I love it. Um, so obviously at GE Healthcare, you do both products and services. Do you see or do you employ human-centered design techniques differently, whether it's a product or a service?
Well, what's interesting is we started our own take on design thinking, the vernacular term that's really not new, and I'll talk about that when you ask me in a little while. We started our own design thinking approach around the time I got there 8 years ago. I had had the privilege to go to the Stanford D School while I was at Procter & Gamble in a similar kind of role. And we sort of understood how to facilitate design thinking in the way they teach it at the D School at Stanford, and the way IDEO kind of resurrected design thinking, among others, in that vernacular. And so I brought that to GE. I sent people to the D School. Actually, we teach there now. We're kind of feeding back to the grid.
Excellent.
But we started something we call Menlo, after Thomas Edison's Menlo Park Research Lab in New Jersey, and the first industrial research lab. Well, what's really curious about that is if you read the book Midnight Lunch, you'll see that Edison was doing exactly these things 130 years ago, and 120 years ago, and 100 years ago. He iterated himself through to the filament in the light bulb, the 10,000 things he tried, by what we call yes-anding, accepting and adding to the ideas that had gone before, instead of saying can't, won't, don't know how, been there, done that, which is what we often hear when we're making brainstorming lists on flip charts in conference rooms we call sensory deprivation chambers. So what our Menlo sessions are meant to do is to use a lot of improvisational techniques to give people back the tools they had when they were kids. If I asked you, what's 4 chairs and a bed sheet? What did you do with that when you were a little kid? 4 chairs and a bed sheet.
I made a fort.
You made a fort.
Yeah.
Everybody listening has done that. Doesn't matter where they are in the world, they've taken 4 chairs or something and a bed sheet or a blanket, and they've made a fort. Did anybody have to tell you how to design the fort?
They did not.
Did anybody have to tell you how to play in the fort?
They did not.
Did anybody have to tell you how to play in the fort with your friends?
They did not.
And you kept playing in that fort endlessly and adding to it and making it bigger until your mom or dad said, clean up that mess. And you'd probably dragged in CD players or record players if you're old enough, and hot and cold running everything. And it was a universe you created. Well, somewhere along the way, we all lost that. It was beaten out of us maybe when we were 10. And they said, you can't do that anymore. But it's hiding. It's lurking in somewhere back in one of the cortexes of your brain. And what we do with teams is we bring that stuff back out. So, the toughest hombres you can find, the hardest core business people or engineers, whatever, who come into our sessions with their arms crossed, and they say, I don't have time for this fluffy bunny stuff. I got a quarter to make. I got a project to get out. They're the ones you can't get rid of at the end of the week when you show them how creative they still are. Well, I'm not creative. I can't draw. Well, when you were making 4 chairs and a bed sheet, you could draw, you could build things, you could tell stories, you could work together with your friends. Nobody had to tell you how to do it. So the dirty little secret about design thinking is simply to return people to that point in time in their life where they were fearless to express themselves, fearless to innovate, fearless to create things, and iterate very, very quickly rather than overthinking with fear of failure everything that they did. And that's the secret. So we do that in our Menlo sections, and about 90% of the work we do are not on projects or shiny object things. They're business teams who come in with challenges they want to solve using the tools of design thinking. And it's incredible. We've had over 4,000 people come in the last few years from all over the world, from customers included, every conceivable business, legal people, field service engineers, marketing analysts. Yes, we do work on shiny object projects too in there. But the fundamental notion to it is it's all about the stuff you did when you were little kids and giving you back those tools.
That's great. That's a great analogy too, because actually the only person who ever told me to not make the fort was my big brother. because he wanted to make the Ford.
See,
You know,
there you go.
and he wasn't much that much
There
older.
you go.
I wanted to ask you one more question, and then we've had some questions come in from our audience.
Oh.
So it's open-ended question, but where do you see the future of design over maybe the next, let's say, 5 years, maybe 5 years and 10 years? What's your crystal ball say?
So as a corporate design leader and a guy who obviously worked in design advocacy when I was executive director of the Industrial Designer Society, what I know is designers need to show up as business people in the context of their discipline. If you ask any other person in any other business, to characterize themselves, well, they're business people. It doesn't matter whether they're in marketing or sales or finance. They're there to support a business. Designers have not historically done a good job of that. And the more we can ramp up and understand we have to meet our audience where they are, that we have to speak in the language of business and not just imagine, well, if it's cool, they'll come, I think the more we'll have a seat at the table. The not so dirty little secret is we work in teams. We don't work in isolation. I work with every imaginable discipline in our company and all the companies that I've worked for. And you have to have business acumen to advance the cause of design. Otherwise, you're just the last decoration station, and isn't that cute? And that's how you move off the dime.
Okay, excellent. So, like I said, there's more questions that have come in than we're going to be able to answer with the time we have allotted. But one of them that it's been asked about two different ways. I'll try to paraphrase it. But what advice would you give to an executive interested in adopting human-centered designs into a company that maybe has been, standoffish?
Well, there's a principle called spend a little, learn a lot. And a lot of companies think this has to be an or rather than an and, that you have to change everything you're doing. The idea is that this is complementary and supplementary. It doesn't have to be a threat. It lives beautifully alongside all the other processes that we find in black belt, Six Sigma type companies where there's rigorous engineering principles and stage gates to pass through. We're really just trying to connect back to the human beings who will use whatever the output is. And that can be in the way things are created and what comes out the manufacturing line. So the advice is get good advice. Go to firms like Intersection who know everything there is chapter and verse about how to build in a strategy that's small to go test, to try these techniques. The other thing that's really important is if you can't do this as like a one-off. We're going to have a workshop and we're going to use design thinking. Well, that's nice. But when you turn the people who participated, as we say, back into the wild, they're going to go back into an environment where nobody else has had that experience. So think of it in terms of you're putting apps in people's heads. So the next time you're running a meeting and you're brainstorming, instead of making a list, maybe you can do something, brainstorm around the words, wouldn't it be nice if? And have people understand that your job here is to take that idea that this person put out, no matter how silly it sounds, and add on top of it. And your job is to add on top of that one and make one silly idea into 400 amazing ones, or map opportunities and don't leap to ideas. So I think it's really a question of just start small, take a few steps, spend a little, learn a lot, get the best advice you can from agencies like Intersection. I'm not pitching you guys. But you know how to do this stuff, and you've done it. You've helped us tremendously over the years, and you can help others.
That's excellent advice. And I have to tell you, and as the audience knows, and anyone that has joined our continuing webinar series, we will be archiving this webinar because the amount of information you shared, even with some of the bullet points that we captured on the PowerPoint, it really is deserving of going back through, pulling out the nuggets. And really being able to apply some of this advice that you've given. So, Bob Schwartz, really appreciate you taking time out of your day to spend a little bit of time with Intersection and our audience. And thank you all for joining us today. Again, this will be archived on our webpage, and we look forward to you joining our next webinar series coming up in about 30 days.
Thank you very much.